In 1815, Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia exploded. It was the largest volcanic eruption in well over 1,000 years. Ash and dust spread across the skies of the entire planet, leading to what has come to be known as the year without a summer. The volcanic ash was wreaking havoc on the climate, causing massive famines throughout Europe and forcing a group of young writers to take shelter in their villa on Lake Geneva to avoid the relentless rain. Among them were the romantic poets Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, Byron's personal physician John Polidori, and two teenage stepsisters, Claire Claremont and Mary Godwin. It was the boredom of being cooped up in a house during the dark and gloomy weather that led to the group reading a book of old German ghost stories, and naturally, what with all the aspiring writers present, a contest was proposed to see who could write the best ghost story. Only two published works came from this competition: John Polidori's novel The Vampire, which, while fairly unremarkable in itself, would later inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. The second came not from one of the poets, but from the unassuming Mary Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, a book that would endure far beyond the works of her contemporaries. In fact, it was only a couple of years before the first theatrical adaptation of the novel Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein premiered in London. Of course, given the subject matter, a moral panic ensued, and the London Society for the Prevention of Vice issued pamphlets warning of the dangerous immorality of the story. Naturally, this led to a huge spike in ticket sales, and soon there were multiple rival productions. Frankenstein quickly became massively popular to the point where the novel itself was eclipsed by its many adaptations, and the popular understanding of the story became kind of muddled, so let's set the record straight. There is an oft-repeated quote about Frankenstein which goes, "Knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein is not the monster. Wisdom is knowing that Frankenstein is the monster." This is a pretty narrow read of the story because both creator and creature are monstrous in their own ways, but Frankenstein is a far more nuanced story than you can capture in a pithy quote. Yes, the name Frankenstein refers to Victor, not to his creation, because the monster doesn't have a name, because Frankenstein runs away from him. He abandons his child immediately after he is born, which leads us to the far more pernicious misconception about Frankenstein. Really, it doesn't matter that much if the names get muddled. The more serious misunderstanding comes from viewing the Frankenstein myth not as a story about life, death, guilt, and a whole lot of other stuff we'll get into later, but as a warning against scientific progress. As film critic Kim Newman wrote, "Despite the frequent use of the Frankenstein name as a stick to beat science, as in scares about genetically modified frankenfood, it should be remembered that Victor's crime is not making a monster, but being a bad parent. In most adaptations, Victor abandons his creation as soon as he sees him, as in Kenneth Branagh's 90s film, which is mostly faithful to the book, but as a film is just painful to watch." This goes on for like 3 minutes, but eventually Robert De Niro's creature is hounded by the local townspeople who form angry mobs so readily it's almost comical.
Mob supplies! Get your angry mob supplies here!
The point though is that the monster is made monstrous by how people treat him. Frankenstein is not really a warning about the dangers of playing God, but a story about empathy. The creature is cruel and murderous because of the way he has been treated. He even explicitly states this in the novel. "I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces and triumph. Remember that, and tell me why I should pity man more than he pities me." De Niro's monster is certainly malicious, and not all that sympathetic to be honest, because we're told the story from Victor's point of view. We're encouraged to look upon the monster with disgust, which isn't hard because, well, I mean, look at him. But other adaptations approach the story from a different perspective and thus change it entirely. Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands is a loose adaptation, and one that treats its characters with more compassion than most. Edward is not loathed by his creator in this film, but his father dies before he can complete him, leaving him with literal manifestations of the creature's misbegotten strength in the form of his titular Scissorhands. Edward is, like the creature, a scared, confused, but ultimately benevolent person. But because people don't understand him or extend empathy to him, he ends up killing someone. It captures the inherent tragedy of the story better than a lot of direct adaptations do. Edward's hands work as a metaphor for the danger that can be unleashed when society mistreats someone, and because we're told the story from Edward's point of view, we see that he's, well, not exactly harmless, at least innocent. Edward does begin to fit into the community when people recognize that the very things that make him strange and dangerous are also the things that make him unique and talented. He cuts hedges into fantastical topiary, then moves on to dog grooming and eventually hairdressing. But none of it can last, because the intolerance of some ruins things for everyone else. Most of the really interesting takes on this story demonstrate how people's reactions to the seemingly monstrous actually end up defining how monstrous the so-called monster really is. Mary Shelley's life certainly affected her work, and many of the central themes of Frankenstein link directly back to her own experiences. Mary had already given birth to 2 children, both of whom had died before she began writing Frankenstein. She was well acquainted with death, her own mother having died less than a month after she was born, and the comforting idea of heaven was probably lessened by the fact that both her father and her eventual husband were both atheists. It's not entirely clear how religious Mary herself was, but there are certainly references to religion in the text, most notably to the Greek myth of Prometheus, who created humans and gave us fire and was punished by Zeus just as Victor is punished. But it isn't God that punishes Victor Frankenstein, it's his own creation, who quotes Paradise Lost a lot and eventually reaches the same conclusion that Satan does in Milton's poem, that it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The creature wreaks vengeance on Victor for his mistreatment and blames his creator for all the bad things that happened to him, even the ones that didn't directly involve him, which is a sentiment I'm sure lots of people can relate to. Who among us hasn't at some dark point in our lives cursed our parents for forcing us into existence? And very few people could claim to have as much reason to resent their parents as the creature does. But does Victor deserve to be punished? Where does the blame lie for his creature's miserable life? In the most famous adaptation, James Whale's Universal films Frankenstein and its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, rather than running away from his creation, Victor, or as he's for some reason called here, Henry, chains him up in a dungeon and allows his sadistic assistant Fritz to taunt the creature with a flaming torch, which ends poorly for Fritz, and everyone involved actually. Whale's adaptations, which are arguably still the best ever made despite being pretty loose reworkings of the source material, explore the themes of death and guilt extremely effectively. Henry literally throws dirt in the face of a Grim Reaper statue in the film's opening scene, so we already know that his views on the sanctity of life, death, graveyards and religion are pretty cavalier. He creates his monster, neglecting his family and friends, but then chains it up in a dungeon. When his creature kills people, including a little girl, either through an attempt at self-preservation or in a misguided attempt to play a game, he does so because Henry neglected him as a child. The burden of guilt is placed squarely on Henry, because his creature is repeatedly shown to possess an extremely limited mental capacity. He's more like an animal or a baby than a monster. He doesn't even speak until the sequel, and is constantly just looking for a friend, for someone to take care of him and give him company, rather than contempt and cruelty. In Bride of Frankenstein, the creature does befriend an old blind man, and we actually see a glimpse of what his life could be like if people were more tolerant of him. It's a wonderfully innocent port in the storm, but of course, it can't last. As soon as some local hunters find the monster, they try to kill him, and in the ensuing chaos, the hut burns down. The old man is left with nothing. The small cabin was all he had, and it's ruined. All innocence and generosity is destroyed, and any hope is quickly quashed. Wales films seem to support the idea that the monster had the potential to be happy and to bring happiness to others, as he does to the lonely old blind man, but none of it can last because that's not how the world would treat him. The monster recognizes that he has no hope of happiness at the end of Bride of Frankenstein and attempts suicide, echoing Wales' own eventual death.
We belong dead.
In a more unconventional take on the story, May shows us the isolation of the creator and how that isolation compels, in this case her, to create a Frankenstein's monster out of the body parts of all the people who have wronged her through rejection, cruelty, or indifference. Frankenstein can be a lot of different things, and in May it takes the form of loneliness. May, our titular character, is strange to be sure. She's off-putting and is weird and erratic enough that we understand why people who are initially intrigued by her quirkiness are quickly put off. She's not just quirky, she's dangerous. She seems to be mentally ill, or is at least so isolated from society that she can't function within it, growing up as she does in what is implied to be a very unhealthy, possibly even abusive household. May effectively merges the creator and creature into one character. In a sense, her wrath is provoked, like the creature, by the way society has let her down, so in the end, her only recourse is to kill the people who have wronged her. It's uncomfortable to watch, but it challenges us constantly not to look away, to understand and empathize with a woman who could be termed a monster. May forces us to watch as she does terrible things, but the film never allows us to distance ourselves from her perspective. We do understand her and feel sorry for her, even as we feel disgusted by her actions. The Frankenstein story is both simple and complex enough to allow people to read it and adapt it in radically different ways, and the best of them, like May and the James Whale films, force us into perspectives that we would never arrive at ourselves. The monster is a victim of circumstance. He has been thrust into the world, and as the ending of May shows us, the monster could be benevolent if we would only allow it to be. Was it immoral to create the creature? Well, maybe, but not because it offends whatever gods you may or may not believe in. It was immoral to bring a creature into the world that would never be accepted here. Speaking of which... Frankenstein is a story by, for, and about outsiders. Mary Shelley was a young woman when she wrote the novel in a world where young women were second-class citizens. It would be another 100 years after the publication of Frankenstein before women could legally vote in England, and Mary Shelley was certainly aware of the inequities she faced as a woman. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the earliest feminist advocates who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and her father, William Godwin, was a well-known writer and political radical. Despite her prestigious parents, though, Mary felt like an imposter during the famous writing competition at the Villa Diodati. She struggled for several days to come up with a story, and her feeling out of place would come to inform her most famous work considerably. The monster is fundamentally alone. He is shunned by society for what he is, not because of what he does, and as such, this story tends to attract people who feel marginalized by society. James Whale was an openly gay man in Hollywood during the 1930s when he made his two Frankenstein films, and there's certainly a queerness that runs through both of them, particularly Bride of Frankenstein, as Michael Mallory notes in the book Universal Studios Monsters. Dr. Pretorius, as played by Ernest Thesiger, is so waspish and effeminate that Henry's protest that he cannot go back with the professor because he is about to be married can be taken on more than one level, no doubt intentionally so. It is another of Whale's little jokes that would fly by most of the audience and the Breen office. Bride of Frankenstein has a distinctly camp and morbid sense of humour, perhaps inspired by a feeling of otherness James Whale felt throughout his life, for being a gay man in a homophobic world, and for being an artist who attempted to project an upper-crust manner despite coming from a working-class family in the industrial town of Dudley in the Midlands of England. Ian McKellen, himself a gay man, played Whale in the film Gods and Monsters, in which we see the last days of Whale's life as he reminisces about the past and gradually reveals how broken he is inside. But it's not all doom and gloom in Frankenstein. There's also sex, although rarely in the, shall we say, traditional sense of the word. Victor Frankenstein creates life without a woman, which sounds pretty gay to me, and is made explicitly sexual in the Andy Warhol-produced Flesh for Frankenstein, which is pretty much what you'd expect from a film produced by Andy Warhol. It's weird and kinky and kinda uncomfortable to watch. Here, Dr. Frankenstein is married to his sister, but they each engage in sex exclusively with other people, or in Frankenstein's case, with the open body cavity of one of his creations, which act more like those old voodoo zombies than anything else.
To know death, Otto, you have to fuck life in the gallbladder.
Victor has no interest in having sex with his sister wife, but gets off on the creation of life. He's closer to Jeffrey Dahmer than Victor Frankenstein as depicted by Mary Shelley, abducting young men and women, literally cutting a guy's head off, and then stitching them back together in order to create weird sex zombies who he dresses in creepy outfits to stop their bodies from literally falling apart. Never before or since has the madness of Frankenstein been caught so effectively, if rather strangely, on screen. But the Frankenstein story speaks to me more so, I think, because I am also a gay person and just a generally weird, anxious and depressed one, because it captures a lot of the experience of feeling like you don't quite belong here. Frankenstein is the only novel that has ever made me cry, because the feeling of being a monstrous creature that the world will inevitably hate is something I've struggled with a lot, and this story about a young man who works obsessively on creating something, then has a mental breakdown once it's finished, is something I'm sure lots of people who make stuff can relate to. Mary Shelley was an outsider, James Whale was an outsider, and the creature is the ultimate outsider. He has nobody, he's the only existing member of his species, and he doesn't even know what he is, or why he exists. Frankenstein shows us a normal relationship, then smashes it to pieces. Victor's sister wife, yeah, that's in the novel, is killed by the monster in a fit of rage once Victor destroys the female creature he was making for him. Nobody gets out of this alive and well, even in the more light-hearted adaptations. In the Rocky Horror Picture Show, a young couple get engaged, and even as they're singing jubilantly, we get the sense that there's something off. It might be that the church where they just saw their friends get married is now being set up for a funeral, linking the themes of love and death together from the very start, but the shaky foundations of Brad and Janet's relationship become more pronounced as the transgressive elements of the film challenge them. They're stripped of their clothes, kept in a mansion where everyone acts like a lunatic, and a cross-dressing scientist happily tells them that
I've been making a man with blonde hair and a tan, and he's good for relieving my tension.
The queerness bursts through with raucous shouts of time warp and sweet transvestites, and Frankenfurter is so open about having made his creature for sex that Brad and Janet don't even know how to react. By the end of the film, once the castle has taken off and flown into outer space, this movie is amazing. Brad and Janet and their old professor are left scrambling around in the dirt. The otherness is so overwhelming that it effectively destroys everything in its path, just as Victor's creation of the creature ultimately destroys his entire family. Frankenstein is queer as fuck, and this can be celebratory, or harrowing, or just strangely comical depending on how the story and its characters are approached. This is what makes Frankenstein such a fascinating and enduring story. It can be so many different things, which allows people to adapt it in drastically different ways, eschewing the parts that don't work for them and placing greater prominence on the aspects that speak to them as artists. My favourite Frankenstein movies probably won't be your favourite Frankenstein movies, and that's great because it demonstrates how flexible the story is. Some people view it as an anti-science condemnation of man's hubris, some view it as a story about the importance of empathy, some as a comical tale about death, and some as some kind of weird sex fantasy. Frankenstein can be anything. Mary Shelley, by all accounts, had a pretty miserable life. Her father disowned her when she eloped, all but one of her children died in their infancy, and she was a woman during a time when that was considered reason enough to dismiss her as a human being. But more so than her famous parents or her poet husband or any of the intellectuals she felt so intimidated by when she wrote this story as a teenager, Mary Shelley's work lives on in everything from horror films to children's cartoons, from serials to action movies, stop-motion animations, commercials, TV shows, musicals, biopics, slasher movies, kaiju films, weird comedies, blaxploitation movies, novels, poems, paintings, anything you can think of, it's there. The Frankenstein myth and its characters endure in seemingly endless forms. In the foreword to the 1831 edition of her novel, Mary Shelley wrote, "And now, once again, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper." And it has, and will continue to do so, beyond the wildest dreams of its creator. Frankenstein will outlive us all.
He'll eat nutritious, high protein, and swallow raw eggs. Try to build up his shoulders, his chest, arms, and legs. Such an effort, if he only knew of my plan. In just 7 days, I can make you a man.